I first became interested in prisons through a basketball team I was coaching in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I was from. And so I was coaching a basketball team when I was in high school myself, 16 years old, and the guys they were 10 or 11. And so I got to know this group of young men in the city and knew them through coaching the team and worked with them after. And when they turned about 17 or 18, 19 years old, a number of them started to go into prison. And so it was visiting people that I knew, that I cared for, kind of opened my eyes to prisons. I'd never thought about it before. I spent some time in Brazil working with kids living on the street, and that population really overlapped with the prison population. I did a few other things, and when I went to graduate school, I did a doctoral program in sociology. I had heard about these prison churches in Brazil. So I spoke Portuguese, and I heard about these churches that were run by the inmates inside of prison. And they had almost become institutionalized in Sao Paulo and Rio and the big cities, that every prison had one of these prison churches. And so I was interested in religion, interested in Christianity in the global South. And so that's really how I started to look more deeply into these prison churches in Brazil.
Okay. And before then, I think just doing some reading, you actually went to prison.
I did. I started the research out by spending 2 weeks living in prison, kind of as an inmate. You know, I wasn't actually an inmate. I could have left at any time, but I slept in the same cells, ate the same food, and really did the routine as if I were incarcerated in Brazil. And so I had 3 cellmates, and I was living on a block with 80 people. And it was, you know, I really learned a lot by doing that. First of all, one of the things I learned out is that in Brazil, in prison cultures, visitors are really treated with respect. And so I was frankly nervous when I first got in there. I thought this sounded like a great idea to really get into the research. And then when the day came, I thought, what have I got myself into? So I checked into the prison, and the administrator brought me to the cell block and basically said, you know, here's your pillow and blanket. We'll see you in a week. And I thought, what do I do now? But I was able to see firsthand what prison looks like. And I could never really understand what prison's actually like, but I got a bit of a taste of it. And I remember I'd been there for, I guess, 3 or 4 days. And at that point, I kind of knew the routines of prison. I knew what I'd be doing the next day, who I'd be doing it with, kind of the routines. And the guy on the bunk below me, he snored louder than anyone I've ever met. And it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and my whole bunk was shaking, and I was kind of wide awake looking out the barred window. And I remember thinking to myself, I think he had 7 years to go. And I thought, wow, what if I had 7 years left? I had spent 4 days in here and had another week to go, but what if I had 7 years? And it was in that moment where kind of the heaviness or the tragedy or the despair of prison, I understood it in a way that I couldn't have understood it by just reading about it or talking to someone. And I understood why when we woke up every morning, we had a cup of coffee and a piece of bread, and the breakfast line is the most kind of depressing part of the day, because the whole group was waking up to that reality that here I am. And I had, you know, at that point, if I thought of the next 7 years, I wanted to finish my dissertation, but I also wanted to get married and had all these hopes and dreams. And I just thought, what if all that was just stopped right like this? And I was stuck in this cell. So that's how I started it out. I spent a couple weeks living in there, and yeah, like I said, I was treated well. I remember the first day, the leader, the informal, formal leader said, hey, it's not everyone, we get visitors, but it's not everyone who's going to live here with us. So you're going to be okay. We're glad you're here.
Okay. Was he a gang leader that?
He was in there for his second homicide offense, actually. And what happens in prison is in this particular prison, the guards don't go inside the cell blocks. And so leaders then arise through, you know, among their peers, if you will. And that looks different in different prisons. And so the prison I was at didn't have a gang presence, but the ones in Rio, where I did most of the research for the book, those were completely and totally dominated by the gangs. And so the gang leader in those prisons is the most powerful inmate around there, and controls a lot of everyday life in prison. Who sleeps where, controls the drug trade going in and out, dishes out the consequences for breaking rules. And then another person of importance, or a leader, is the prison pastor as well. So those two positions are very prominent positions inside. It was in Rio. Okay. I remember the first time I went into the jail that I'd spend a lot of time in over the next year. I simply couldn't believe how many people were in there. There were cells that were built for 15 people, and there were 80 people crammed in there. Even at 15, it'd be crowded, but there were 80. And so what happens at night when everyone's locked in, they sleep head to toe on a single concrete mattress, and then head to toe on the floors. And there's still not enough room, so some people will sleep standing up. They'll tie the shirt around themselves to the bar and try to sleep standing up, and there's hammocks that go everywhere. And so it is the conditions are shocking when you first get in. And I remember walking into that situation, and I thought to myself, I would make a great hostage. If they want to get attention, let's get this guy. He's not going to fight back, and the news will definitely pick up on it. But then what I also saw is that when I'd walk in with pastors, there was different church groups would visit almost every day. But what would happen in these places is that someone would yell, "The church is coming down." And all of a sudden, the radio that played all day would be turned down. Men would put their shirts on. Even the ones who weren't part of the church or had no plans of participating in the service, they would put their shirts on. They'd stop smoking. They'd stop smoking drugs. They'd turn off the tattoo gun that was running in the corner. And during those moments, all of a sudden, this kind of, jam-packed, filthy cell block on the outskirts of Rio became kind of a sacred space. And then the church gathered around, and the other men, like I said, who weren't participating, would go into their cells and would treat that area with reverence. And so they're very violent places, and the gang warfare tends to bring out these extreme cases of violence where messages want to be sent throughout the country with decapitations and things that you can hardly imagine. But these are done in spaces where the state or the guards or the correctional officers have almost zero presence inside of prison. And the jail that I was at, the correctional officers, they wouldn't go behind the cell block for anything. They were just scared to death.
Yeah.
Yet the church would come in and they were treated with, really respect. And I saw pastors bringing in their, teenage daughters along with them to sing and to preach. And I remember initially thinking, wow, here this guy is bringing his daughter in with 400, convicted criminals, and there's no one to protect them. But then after going there day after day, I realized that the risk for visitors coming in is very low, that the prison code says we treat these people with respect.
Well, we'll return to the prisons, but just reading the book and watching the film, the documentary, you set it in the prisons in the context of the favelas, that they're sort of interwoven with one another. So let's step outside the prison. What's life like in the favela?
Well, in Rio de Janeiro, there's almost two Rio de Janeiros. There is one that you see in the brochures for the Olympics and the beach, and it's a beautiful slice of the city. It's kind of a 5%, a little beach chunk, and it's a beautiful place. The mountains going up, but just behind that is a whole different world. And the prisons are made up exclusively of people from that other side of Rio, from the poor, marginalized places. In fact, the prisons really kind of reflect Brazilian society or Rio's culture in kind of a unique way. First is that almost exclusively poor people are in the prisons. For example, if you have a college degree, you don't go into those prisons. You go into a different place. And so you have a job with the state. If you have a work for the fire department or police department, for example, you go to a different prison that looks nothing like that. And so if you have any finger in the middle class, you're not going to those places. So when you get to the cell blocks, you have a kind of a slice of the poorest part of Rio. And there's a couple things you see. One is that I can speak from the US example. We have very kind of either or racial classifications, black, white, Latino. But in Brazil, it's a little different. There's kind of shades of and there is
coffee colored. In Venezuela, they'd say we have white coffee, we have black coffee, and we have coffee with cream.
Yes, and what you see in the cells in Rio is that you have darker skin color, and than the rest of the city.
Okay.
And so that's what's mostly true in Brazil is in Rio, the poorer the neighborhood, the darker the skin color. And you walk into the cell blocks and you see that very very quickly as well. And then you also see a reflection of some of the religious realities in Brazil. So Brazil is the biggest Catholic country on earth. It's also one of the largest Pentecostal countries. But the Catholic Church really is strongest in the middle and upper classes. And when you go into the favelas and the poor neighborhoods, all of a sudden these are largely Pentecostal places. And that Pentecostalism is by far the most practiced faith in the favelas of Rio, and much more so in prison. Also, you see the gangs that run the favelas, their power, and they run the favelas. And so when I visit families and churches in these neighborhoods, what they will often do is they will create barricades in the roads leading their neighborhoods, so vehicles can't enter. And then they'll post usually teenagers with AR-15s or fully automatic weapons. And in order to enter the neighborhoods, you have to pass under the watch of them. So they decide who lives where, who can hold a party on the street, or they totally control those neighborhoods. And then usually they have when I was there at least, they would have a table set up that would have 3 to 4 or 5 cardboard boxes full of drugs and package of cocaine or marijuana. And they would have gang members with, once again, enormous weapons and bags full of cash, and people would line up to buy the drugs as if they were buying an apple in the supermarket. You could see people holding bags of cocaine up and looking at them, and they would make the transactions in the open. And so the gang really has to control the whole neighborhood for that sort of system to work. And in the same way that the gangs control parts of the prison. And so looking at the prisons, you learn a little bit about what's going on in the rest of Brazil as well.
And I remember reading a report when the government wants to have a go at cleaning out the favelas, they turn up with tanks.
Yes, and that happened when I was there, and it felt like it was there was one day where they were coming in, and the streets were. It was a Saturday. The streets were empty. There was 2 of us on a bus, and the other person on his cell phone was telling his mother, "I'm coming home. Don't worry." But it felt like a war zone. And then if you look at the homicide rates or the rates and police violence, it also looks like a civil war. And so it does have that aspect to it.
I think you described the people in the favelas and in the prisons as Brazil's killable people.
Yeah, I did. And this, I was looking at the homicide rates, and I didn't think I was looking at it right. I thought I had been misinterpreting this or something like that. But there was a kind of a group of people in the same group that goes into prison that suffers, tremendous rates of violence that you don't see in many other parts of the world. And there simply hasn't been that sort of a reaction from the people living there or from the country kind of saying that, this is not right, or how can we tolerate this? And so once again, it's the same group that almost all of these murders are happening within certain parts of Rio. And so in the same places where the Pentecostal church is the strongest. And so the people who are going to prison and the people who are being killed, the Pentecostal church tends to resonate most strongly in those areas. And so that's why I kind of talked about Pentecostalism as the faith of the killable people.
Mm.
And so I think of a pastor, Marcio, who I got to know. He uh, grew up in a horrible situation, kind of abandoned when he was young, was into drugs as a 13-year-old, joined the gangs right away. They kind of embraced him and was out there with his weapon selling drugs. Got to prison when I think he was 19 years old, made a conversion inside of prison, joined the prison church, got out, stuck it with it for a little while, but then actually got back with the gangs and killed somebody.
Mm.
And so if you would have looked 3 years after his initial conversion, you would say, well, that didn't work at all. He didn't stick with it. But a second time through prison, he had what he said, a kind of a deeper understanding and made a deeper commitment. And now he's been a pastor of a church and a real leader in one of the worst parts of Rio for the last 10 years. And so looking 15 years out, all of a sudden this person who was, public enemy number one, had part of a gang, actively sold drugs, was a violent person, has now been someone completely different because of a conversion experience inside of prison. And there are really countless of conversion stories, and I saw people give their lives to God. And what I thought initially was you see it enough, and how do you prove your conversion, especially inside of prison when it's a very emotional time? You're usually coming through the worst part of your life, or have just done the worst thing you've ever done. Certainly, and you're scared to death of the people around you. Converting seems like a good idea. But inside of prison, what people really look at is how you act. They can see your day-to-day behavior 24 hours a day, because you're inside of prison. It's very difficult to live one way during the church service and a different way throughout the rest of the week. And so what I saw is people's lives change, but their fellow inmates look to see as your daily actions change. Do you stop doing drugs? Do you stop doing all of these things that you did beforehand? And that is kind of the currency or proof of transformation inside of prison.
So it's not just I've had this, emotional, powerful, they have had emotional, powerful experiences. But in prison, what counts is, does your life change?
Yes.
Because is it true if you leave the gang, but you're faking a conversion, they'll come after you?
Mm-hmm. So the gang dominates the prison, and they're the ones who control everything. But the gang says, if you make a conversion and you want to join the 10 or 15% of inmates who live in the prison church, we'll let you go. In some cases, the church has to pay off a debt that the person might owe, or in some cases, the gang says, we'll set you free. But then they watch how you act. And, the gang doesn't want to lose face either. But with the gang, they don't give people a theological test or things to see if the theology all works out. They watch, do you act differently? Do you attend all the church services? Do you stop doing drugs? Do you stop using prostitutes? That is a thing inside of prison. Does the way you speak change? And so there's all sorts of these behaviors that are very visible and that converts are expected to uphold. And so in some ways it's a very legalistic system, because it does really, that's not the only emphasis, but to the unbelievers on the outside looking, if they want to verify that this person had a genuine change in their life, they watch how they act, and watch how they treat others, and watch how they spend their money, and watch how they speak with other inmates.
And you said the prison churches take on some of the characteristics of the gangs.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, it's these churches are started by inmates, and so these aren't branches of prison ministries, or they're not tied to any other church on the outside. And so it would be very unlikely for a church on the outside to say, let's start a prison gang, but a religious one. But when the inmates started, it kind of makes sense. And it makes sense because they live together. And when they have their services, if you're part of the church, if one member goes, everybody goes. And when they go to visiting time, the church all goes at one time. And if, for example, if there's a person who doesn't have a visitor, the someone must take them into their own visiting circle and share the cake or the bottle of Coca-Cola or whatever it is with them. And so it has this gang feel. And initially in the 80s, the gang, the Comando Vermelho, which was part of the recent prison riot just last week, started in Rio. And all of a sudden in the 80s, a number of inmates started to call themselves, instead of the Comando Vermelho, which means Red Command, they called themselves the Comando de Cristo, or Christ Command. So they actually used the name from the gang to start their own church. And then they actually wore suits and ties inside of the prison all day. So all of a sudden you had this band of inmates wearing suits and, ill-fitting suits and ties inside of 110-degree prison. But that's where it started. And then as it's grown...
Because the gangs also have their identifying clothing as well. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. And then also the members were coming from gang life. And so these gangs, they provide a lot for not only inmates, but people living in favelas. They provide an identity, a belonging, especially for people who are pushed out of a lot of other parts of the city and society. The gang gives you a reason and a group to belong to. And so, and the sort of charismatic leadership that a gang leader has really is conducive to Pentecostalism. And it's no surprise that someone who rises in the gang and has that sort of charisma and leadership ability also can make for a great pastor. And in Pentecostalism, you don't have to go through all the formal seminaries and graduations. You need enough people to call you pastor, and then you're a pastor. And so that's sort of, it emphasizes a different sort of leadership ability than a lot of the other churches do. And so some of the men that I saw that were really strong Christian leaders would have never got through a systematic theology class, for example, because they don't have the formal educational background, but they know how to preach, and they know how to communicate, and they know how to lead their peers. And many of them come from gang backgrounds. And so this idea of having this idea of their church looking like a gang makes sense in that place. And it also provides kind of a sense of dignity to the people in it, that this is our church. I heard this a lot, but this is our church, and we're proud of it. And it's a different sort of ownership that the men had for their church than it would be if they were just participating in another church's ministry or in an outsider ministry. Because a lot of pastors visited, but they were kind of viewed as supplemental or to help out the real ministry that was going on. And that was when no one else was there. That happened the other 23 hours a day, when the people who were, when they were living together in community. And that's where the real work happened. And that is difficult for someone from the outside to do. So the criminals in Rio are really considered the lowest of the low. I mean, they're often considered, this is the reason our city doesn't work. This is why we're scared to go outside. And so when you see images of Brazil of kind of the, poor children in the favelas, well, they garner a lot of sympathy, but not the people who are holding knives to people's throat or shooting up the neighborhood. And so I think that's one of the reasons the high murder level is tolerated and the horrible conditions in the prisons. But the Pentecostal pastors, the one that I saw, really treated people as if their lives mattered. I saw this in a few ways. One was the way they spoke to people who were actively involved in the gangs, that this message again, that you have worth, that God loves you, what you're doing now, even though you're hated by people on the outside, that God loves you. And I saw, a number of times pastors put their hands on the heads of gang members as they held suitcases full of cash or had automatic weapons on their shoulders. and gold dripping down from their ears and
This
wrists.
is out. I think outside the prison,
Yes,
in the
yeah,
favela. Yeah.
outside of prison. And then inside of prison, the fact that they were there visiting, that they said it's worth it for me to go out of my way and to come into these awful conditions to visit you and to take messages back to your family, or to bring a bag of rice and beans and chicken to people's families who are suffering. And that really, and I think that's one of the reasons why Pentecostals are so respected in the poorer areas, and especially inside of prison, is because they address some of these real needs, and that speaks, very loudly to inside of prison.
And I was moved by one of the stories of some Pentecostals in the favela, moving amongst the gang members with their, weapons and the like, and their drugs and their money, and offering prayer. And the gang members treating them with respect, bowing their heads, receiving prayer. And so this is going on outside, in the encounters with the gangs.
Yeah. So one thing that I saw is I explained the way they sell drugs. They have kind of this open air drug market. And if a pastor wants to come in who has permission, and do a revival or preach or something like that, or do some sort of prayer ministry, they will move that drug spot into a different place so as not to be disrespectful. And I even saw cases where the gang leaders would command their members to bring in plastic chairs and help set up for the church to have a space there. And so there is that respect that goes on in these areas outside of prison and inside of prison. The one thing I would say, though, is that what the Pentecostals don't try to do is they don't go for a regime change. And so while the Pentecostals may not call the gang leaders filthy animals that deserve to die, they also don't necessarily question that the legitimacy of their presence in these neighborhoods. And I think most people would say that the gangs have overall a tremendously negative impact on these places. But what I didn't see is pastors or Pentecostal groups uniting to try to force the gangs out, both inside of prison and in the neighborhoods. And so maybe if they were trying to do that, you might see a different relationship.
Yeah.
But what I saw in Brazil was really a mutual respect one for the other. And kind of this odd even though that the Pentecostals were actively trying to reduce the number of gang members, the gang still treated them with respect and had this clause that if you leave the gang to join the church, then we don't touch you. So.
And so what characterizes Pentecostalism in the favelas and in the prisons, where you said, I think 10 or 15% have turned and believed?
They live in community. So they live together in the same, inside of prison. You're living with the people that you go to church with. There's a few other things. The music is very important. And so where I grew up in my own kind of church history and things like that, whether I realized it or not, the sermon was really treated as kind of the meat of the service. And the songs are almost kind of optional. If you have to miss something, you can show up a little late and you haven't, it's just getting warmed up. But the sermon, kind of the intellectual teaching part was the meat of it. And what I saw in the church services inside of prison is that a lot of the theological teaching and healing and the message of Christ came through in the singing. And I saw it happen very consistently through. Not to say the sermon wasn't important, but the singing really did something inside of prison that I hadn't seen in other places. And I think that's true in other Pentecostal churches as well. And not professional singing by any means, but kind of a full, participation. And then also this sense of it was led by the people from the neighborhood, or in this case, from the actual cell blocks. And so it wasn't led by foreign missionaries or even by seminary trained professionals. It was led by people who live down the block and who in many ways are going through some of the same hardships or difficulties there. And so inside of prison, you don't have nearly the sort of scandals around celebrity pastors or promises of prosperity theology and things like that. A lot of those more controversial aspects of Pentecostalism kind of disappear once you get inside of prison, and there's more immediate needs. But there is money inside of prison. I mean, the inmates, they take up offerings from what they have, and they spend it in certain ways, and they buy soap and socks and toothbrushes for people who don't have anything. In one case, I saw the church pooled some money to buy a bus ticket for someone else's mother to visit them and things like that. And so they have a pastor, assistant pastor, a secretary, a treasurer, a worship leader, and things like that. So all the trappings and some of the structure of a Pentecostal church, but it is translated or kind of owned and recreated in a different way that fits the prison setting.
Mm. Now, you did this study as an academic sociologist, but just as a personally, how did the experience and of being in the prisons, of seeing what was going on there, how did it change you?
Well, I'm really grateful for having the chance to spend that much time in prison, because I feel like I was able to get a glimpse of Christ that I would not have otherwise had. And so I think that I think there's something to this, that people, kind of on the edges of society in prison, who have had their hopes and dreams and freedom and dignity and all those sorts of things taken from them, and they no longer have anything left to hold on to except for Jesus, that they can hold on sometime in a way that's difficult to see on the outside. And I was in a unique position because I wasn't there to preach. I wasn't there to teach. I wasn't there to even help out. I was kind of observing what they were doing. And I really, I saw what I thought God moved in miraculous ways. And I saw people who are mostly considered good for nothing doing profound, compelling things inside of prison and living in a way that I thought was really admirable. And I couldn't imagine living in such emotional or physical hardship. But I saw people doing it, and they were drawing on God for a strength to not only make it, but kind of live with dignity in these places. And so